Take us back to 1979. You were the mayor of Windsor. Could you tell us a little bit about that position and your responsibilities?
Sure. I was near the end of my first term. Terms are 2 years. It's a volunteer position, unpaid, although I was accused at some meetings of my salary was too high, which was always amusing. But generally, the mayor and the council really have two main functions. I would say the mayor particularly has a kind of formulating policy for the town and broad policy. We had a town manager, a very capable one, in Al Ilg, and all the administrative matters were handled by Al. So our job really as a council was to set broad policy. A lot of that showed up in the budget we did each year, which was a major effort. And throughout the year, we would meet regularly on Monday evenings for our council meetings. The other function, particularly of the mayor, but some of the other council members also participated, is really more of a ceremonial thing. Mayor's expected to show up at a lot of civic affairs, a lot of club meetings, etc., or was asked to. And the town was always pretty appreciative when you showed up. They didn't want a long speech, but they always liked a few words. So those were really the functions of the mayor.
So take us back to October 3rd, 1979. Where were you when the tornado hit?
I was in the town hall. I wasn't doing town business, I don't believe, at the time. I think I was doing a title search. I practiced law and have in town for 54 years, so I'm sure I was doing some title work in the land records, which kept me isolated from whatever was going on outside. So when I got called out of the vault, the land record vault, I was pretty surprised to hear all this commotion going on, and the police radio was plugged in somehow in the town clerk's office, so we were listening to that.
And so, what did you do hearing that? Who's the mayor?
Well, I listened for a while, and this is shortly after 3 p.m., and Nicholas, let's see, what was his name? One of our police officers showed up at any rate and said I was needed in Pequannock, that there had been quite a devastation there. My first thought was that, oh, it's probably exaggerated. You know, my job would maybe to go and try to calm everyone down. And so we headed off for Pequannock. He took a rather circuitous route. We went around and showed up by going, I think, on West Street and coming out right at the Pequannock Bridge. And as we were driving over it, his radio said, "Don't go on the Pequannock Bridge, it's maybe unsafe." And he just looked at me, and I looked at him. We both smiled. He kept going, got up around pretty close to the Windsor Locks border at High Street. And Al Ilg was already there. Several of the town staff were already there. Got out of the car, and we were standing in the middle of the street, but there was such devastation around, no one was driving on it. Till a few minutes later, Al and I were talking about what we were going to do, how we were going to organize, and a Cadillac or a limousine showed up. And sure enough, inside was Governor Grasso and Lieutenant Governor Bill O'Neill. She said to me, "Get in the back." And I thought it was so that we could talk in a little more quiet, and the limousine takes off for Windsor Locks. My first reaction was I was furious, you know. I wanted to be in Pequannock working with the town manager. First priority was to see if anyone needed help or find them. You know, we thought people might be buried under the rubble. This was not too long after 3 that we were there, maybe around 3:30 or so. But anyway, she took me up to Windsor Locks safety complex, and already had some of the state commissioners there and what have you. And essentially, we reviewed what might be able to be done by the state. I subsequently was very appreciative for all the state did, the governor included, and realized that probably I couldn't have been anywhere better than there. When our conference didn't last long, the state police drove me back to Windsor, and we continued to set up searches, organized searches. There'd been some searching done, I'm sure, by folks, but we wanted to make sure everything was covered. First priority was to, as I say, try to rescue anyone that needed help immediately. Based on all the devastation, I expected that we were going to find some bodies too. Actually, there was only one death in Windsor.
Describe the devastation. What were you seeing? Paint us a picture.
On Hollowbrook Road, which was the most startling to me, there were foundations that looked like they had been vacuumed. There was nothing in them. Absolutely nothing. No debris, no nothing. They were just cleaned out. There were many other houses that had damage, some of them severe damage and some relatively minor. But so I remember Hollowbrook Road and maybe one other street in that complex were pretty badly hit. Because of the way the highways twisted around, I was thinking that the tornado had been going back and forth and twisting around, but actually went in a pretty straight line. I learned that the governor had the the State Guard, I guess it was, got some helicopters in, and they took us up on several mornings to view where the devastation was. The tornado took a pretty straight path coming down across Tunxus Avenue, across the Farmington River, up through the settlement there, and then came out around the High Street area, did some damage there, went on up into Windsor Locks, where it did a lot of damage to the commercial area. So, that's where I stayed for at least a couple of days. I don't remember sleeping at all for a couple of days anyway. I know I was very tired at the end of it.
Well, tell us about the kind of disaster response. You and Al Ilg were starting to talk about what you were going to do. What did...
Well, we first organized searches and searched everything pretty thoroughly. At the same time, there was staff working. We were working immediately anyway, out of the Bucquonic Fire Station. They were setting up, with the help of town staff and the town hall, trying to contact all of the homeowners to make sure that the families were all accounted for. That went on for, I think we only had one family missing 10 days after the event, and we located them. So some people had just gone off and stayed with relatives or friends or what have you. So we were tracking them down. It was kind of stage 2 after we knew there were no bodies or no more injuries. We probably had about 100 people go to the hospital. We probably treated locally, that is the EMTs and local doctors and volunteers, maybe treated another 100 or 150 folks for minor problems. But I was amazed that because of all the devastation, that the injuries weren't more numerous. I don't know how a tornado does that. People described how they were picked up and set down. Some of them said they were set down rather gently. But at any rate, that's a full accounting of the injuries anyway, as near as I can remember.
Who do you remember and which organizations? This can be individuals or organizations, but from what we've heard, the community came together, other towns sent help. Describe some of the helpfulness that happened.
That was amazing, and made one very appreciative and kind of proud of the response. People didn't show up for any other reason than that they wanted to help. And starting off, we had people right away, local folks there, contractors with heavy equipment, carpenters and builders and public officials, building inspectors and what have you. They're making sure gas was turned off, electric was okay, so the utilities showed up pretty quickly. There were, as time went on, we would march around, or I would march around anyway, each day, and I had glued to my hip a ham radio operator. Those were the days before cell phones, and communicating was important. So I had my clipboard and my ham operator next to me with a walkie-talkie, calling back to I think the fire station initially, and then we set up probably in the Pequannock school. We might have been in a trailer for a few days, but I think we were in the school pretty quickly. So the communication went back. So I'd be looking for people that needed assistance and getting volunteers there. Just kind of organizing the massive cleanup job. And we hit upon human chains. I'm not really sure where it came from, but we had hundreds of volunteers standing around and no real direction, so we started asking them to put on gloves. We had lots of gloves there, and start handing up stuff to the street where the town could take it away and volunteer contractors could take it away. So we worked these human chains of people just handing up brush, debris, and what have you, and bringing it up, and sometimes either throwing it right in the trucks or piling it up there where the trucks could get at it. We cleaned out pretty much Hathaway Hollow, the lowland between Pequannock Avenue and Hollowbrook Road, pretty much by hand. Generally there'd be a town staff person or a volunteer at the head of the line with a chainsaw, and as the debris got small enough, they'd start handing it up and just passing it along until we got it in a truck and trucked off to the landfill.
How about the state and Governor Grasso and some of the
They were wonderful. Each morning I would go to Windsor Locks. She had set up what she called a command center there. I think I was vice chairman of the recovery effort, some title anyway, but essentially she'd have either everyone or almost every commissioner, state commissioner there at a big table. And I would have my list. Al Ilg and I would have prepared a list the day before, and she'd say, now does Windsor need anything? And I'd start reading my list. And every once in a while, Ella Grasso would turn to a commissioner and say, how about some more trailers for Windsor? And the commissioner, you could see him start to say, oh, wait, we don't have. And she'd just kind of scowl and say, well, we can get it. We can get it. And we got an amazing response, really. People were great. And the state government was great. Yeah.
How about the federal government?
Well, we were declared a disaster area. Jimmy Carter was then president, and we got our declaration fairly soon. FEMA was at work, I know, over the recovery period pretty actively. There was a lot of work on in the rebuilding phase of getting loans and getting grants to tide people over. So that was working pretty well. I didn't have much direct control or involvement with that, but I know it was working pretty well. And the town we were publishing a Phoenix newspaper daily at first, and then I think we were doing it 3 times a week for quite a while, in which we would try to communicate with residents and local people on what was going on, what might be needed.
Yeah. Did your priorities shift, like immediately? You know, you were looking at recovery, and then, you know, week 2, week 3.
It was mostly trying to clear up and clean up and get trailers installed. We got house trailers. I think we had a total of 49 by the time we got our full complement. Getting those all hooked up, they had to be hooked up to electric, sewer, gas, and what have you. And some of those connections were pretty ingenious. Rube Goldbar, if you know the term, sort of pipes going in every direction. I just looked and shake my head, but we had our inspectors out working, and I think they kind of we're not too fussy as long as we could get it to working and it was reasonably safe. It passed. So we got them those hooked up. So people were probably a lot of them were on site that otherwise wouldn't have been able to be there. But then cleaning up enough so that the rebuilding could start was part of the shifting into that phase. But we were still cleaning up, through all of October and a good deal of November. Fortunately, the weather it's a tough time of year in New England, as you know. But it worked out pretty well. We didn't have any major, that I can recall, any major inhibiting weather events during the cleanup. So, but yes, it shifted. It shifted from emergency medical care, locating the families, getting families into some kind of temporary housing, and then getting the cleanup to a stage where you could begin to rebuild and reforest a lot of the areas. That had to wait till spring, as you might guess, but meantime, we did have some wood chips. I had a lot of wood chips, but we were using those to mix with the soil to at least temporarily to slow down erosion that might otherwise have occurred. So, but that's about what I remember anyway of the progress.
Did it surprise you that so many people did not want to just leave? They wanted to rebuild on site.
I don't know if that surprised me so much. I guess you'd expect that they might want to move, but I don't know many that did move. I think most of them stayed on. A lot of the folks built back bigger and better, too. I suppose it was an impetus with, starting off with a major reconstruction job anyway to make their homes a little nicer, a little better. Took a while for the trees to really take hold, but if you drive by 40 years later, why, it looks like a pretty normal neighborhood. You wouldn't know we had all that devastation. And in 1979, it was a real mess.
Talk a little bit about some of the town services that were provided to the tornado victims. I gather that the tax assessment had just happened and they had assessed property which was no longer there. Al Ilg talked a little bit about this.
Yeah, Al Ilg would probably have that information in more detail than I would, but yes, we worked to see if we could get the mayor and the council have no authority under Connecticut law to waive taxes. And taxes are based on an assessment the prior October 1st. So we had just gone through evaluation, or at least we were fixed at the October 1st values for assessing taxes, which then get billed on the next July 1st. Windsor collects taxes once a year. So that we needed some relief for these people who on October 3rd, well, some of them, as I've described, had nothing but a foundation. They needed some relief. So we were working to get the state legislature to help us with that.
You talked a little bit about the exhaustion factor that, you know, right after that you were there for 2 days. So tell us a little bit about that and how you and other townspeople and other people in positions of authority coped.
Well, we had divided the disaster area into districts and had a warden or somebody in each district that was trying to keep control on things. Most of what I did was walking around with my ham operator, walkie-talkie person next to me for most of that time. In the evenings, I would probably be in the command center, as I recall, and participating somewhat in trying to identify and locate people. We had 2 emergency council meetings. We had an emergency board of education meeting I know I attended, several state governmental meetings. A good deal of that was handled through the Windsor Locks Center, but some of them were off-site. So I was running around to a lot of meetings and trying to catch up with paperwork and reports and what have you in the evenings. But most of those first 2 days anyway was walking around in the area. The fire department had searchlights and what have you, and we were still looking for folks.
Mm-hmm. So, do you remember when they found the woman who was killed?
I don't. I did not find her. So someone had told me that they had found a body on, I think it was Settler Circle. Mm-hmm. But no, I was not involved in that, finding her anyway.
Mm-hmm. Were you at the funeral?
Her funeral, I don't remember.
Okay.
I might have been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
40 years ago. My mind is, it's kind of muddy right now. But
So what did you learn from this experience? What kind of takeaways as you look back on it?
Well, mostly, as I said, I was tremendously pleased with the volunteer response that we got. It was rather overwhelming. Our problem was really, at least my problem, was finding things for people to do fast enough because they kept showing up. So it was great. That effort was great. As far as preparedness goes, I'm sure that improved a lot over the next few years. I don't remember having a disaster like this. We had ice storms that don't really compare with this. We did have combustion engineering and Knowles Lab on Day Hill Road had some nuclear stuff there, and I remember a nuclear problem with a truck getting caught on the overpass at Palisado Avenue. And so we had some things to deal with, but nothing like the tornado. That's at least not in my short term. Election was the next month in November. I was at the end of my first term, they're 2-year terms. And by the time I got through my second term, my wife had asked me what I was doing, that I needed to get back to my practice and stop playing mayor. So I didn't run anymore after that. But takeaway for the town was probably an improved emergency reaction. So I think they did a pretty good job.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you would have done differently? 20/20 hindsight.
Me? but not personally. I think walking around, again, I had said I see the mayor's function as part ceremonial, but in this case it was just to make people feel that something was, that things were under control. A lot of people think the mayor has all kinds of magical powers, and I really didn't, not much. I mean, I could make notes on my scratch pad that Hal and I would go over, or the other staff members would go over. We could call in through the ham operating system to get some help where it was needed right away. But just being out there, I think, and letting people know that you're around, and that was probably my major function. There's a lot more people, a lot better qualified, that were doing actual hookups of gas and tending to minor injuries or taking people to the hospital. That all worked pretty well.
Mm-hmm. So would you go and knock on doors or sheds? Or
Oh, sure.
that, and
Where there were still left.
yeah. And what were people telling you that they needed? What were some of the things that just over and over again people were saying, we need this?
Well, some of them needed just about everything. Clothing. We had a lot of donated pots and pans, clothing, household items of all kinds. We pretty well filled up the Pequannock School with that. I remember going around seeing all these piles, and people would come over and take what they needed, and food, meals were prepared. Salvation Army was there, Red Cross. There was never a lack of food. I never went home for food. I always grabbed a sandwich or a cup of coffee or something in my wanderings, so there was plenty of that around. So there was, as I say, the volunteer assistance was amazing.
Mm-hmm. When you look back on it, what are your strongest memories?
Well, the shock that pretty stable community, Hollowbrook Road, those were nice homes. They were colonials. Settler Circle too. They seemed sturdy and permanent to me. And to see just a foundation there where the day before there was a substantial home was very shocking. I was shocked that we didn't find bodies or people hollering for help underneath rubble. I think they call it Hathaway Hollow, where between Pequannock Avenue and Hollowbrook Road was just full of debris and trees and limbs and what have you. Some people's houses were on their neighbor's property. They had been picked up and delivered next door. Those were shocking scenes for me. I thought that was a pretty permanent community. And what I'd seen on television, news before, I always assumed these were kind of insubstantial homes, like maybe trailer parks or something. But a tornado is a pretty powerful thing to lift up a big colonial and take it away somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Lasting effects of the tornado. You've already mentioned, more awareness of the necessity for disaster planning, but anything else? Lasting effects of the tornado on Windsor and Windsor Locks?
Well, I think we got over, as I say, things during the next couple of years anyway. Things settled down pretty well. Long-term rebuilding seemed to go well. As I say, many people wound up with nicer facilities than they had before, nicer homes, expanded or improved, or customized to the way they wanted it a little bit. There were low-cost government loans or guaranteed loans that helped some people get the financing to do the rebuilding. That helped out a lot. Long-term, I think the community settled down pretty much long-term into something very similar to what it was before. Pequannock School came back and was strong as ever. The Pequannock Community Church, they've had their problems, but other churches have since then. St. Joseph certainly came along fine. So I think for one reason or another, anyway, we seem to recover pretty well over the next few years.
Is there anything I've not thought to ask that you recall and
Stands
you
out?
want people to know?
I think you've covered it pretty well, to the best of my recollection anyway. If nothing specific, I don't have anything that I remember specifically other than being very tired. And I think a little shocked at, and then feeling very appreciative of all that help that we got, and from everywhere, other towns, governmental stuff, volunteers, Mennonites. I remember watching them build stairways up to the trailers and what have you. And it just worked, I thought, pretty well for people. They don't train mayors on disaster relief, you know. I ran thinking maybe working on policy and more long-range stuff, and I realized there was a ceremonial side that took me out usually 3 or 4 nights a week, sometimes to 2 or 3 meetings, covering each one a little bit, but no way was I prepared for this, and it seemed to work pretty well. So I don't think you can train a volunteer mayor or council member for this sort of thing. I think you need professional people probably. And we did have civil defense volunteers that are a little more trained, and those ham operators back then were very valuable. Now I suppose everyone has a cell phone, so you'd probably not need that kind of help.
So Jenny, she's maybe got some follow-up questions for
Okay.
you.
Actually, I every question I had popped into my head, you asked. You like literally came. Oh, I'm gonna ask him that, and then you had asked it, and the next. So I don't think I have any follow-up questions. You brought a perspective that was really interesting to me because what the human chain thing, I never had heard that before. And I feel like when you said there were so many people you needed to you wanted to have them to have something to do, I thought I was going to follow up on that, but then you did. So,
Yeah.
I feel like we've asked them everything. Yeah.
That was probably one of the biggest successes, you know, and we asked for volunteers and we got, well, certainly more than hundreds. We got at least maybe 1,000 to 2,000 to 3,000 people that would show up on a weekend. And what do you do with all these people? And that worked out great. It really did.
Wow. Yeah. No, I really like that emphasis because you get that visual of them.
Yeah.
You know, just that stuff's got to get out somehow. You can't get trucks or whatever in there or equipment. So yeah.
And certainly not without doing a lot of damage. You know, we're already worried about erosion and everything.
Right.
But the people just standing there handling it worked out great. So yeah,
That's fabulous.
big success. Yeah.